By the third day after Yam's midnight journey to the shrine, it became impossible to hide the changes that were overtaking my sister from the rest of our village community. Word travels quickly in a small place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the story of Yam's sleepwalking incident had spread from house to house with the speed that only genuine concern can generate. But it wasn't just the story of her nighttime wandering that had captured the village's attention. It was the way she looked now, the way she moved, the way she seemed to be fading away even as she stood right in front of us. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened to the point where they looked like bruises, and her appetite had disappeared entirely. Mother tried to coax her to eat, offering her favorite foods and preparing special treats, but Yam would only pick at her meals, claiming that food had lost its taste. More disturbing to our neighbors was the way Yam had begun to speak. She would answer questions that hadn't been asked, respond to conversations that only she could hear, and sometimes she would stop mid sentence and tilt her head as if listening to instructions from an invisible source. When people asked her what she was hearing, she would look confused and claim that she hadn't been listening to anything at all. The village elders who remembered stories that younger generations had forgotten began to gather in small groups near the temple, their conversations conducted in the hushed tones reserved for serious spiritual concerns. I would see them looking toward our house with expressions of worry, as if they were seeing the warnings they had hoped would never come to pass. Therefore, when old Kun Somchai appeared at our door on that third morning, I knew that our family's private crisis was about to become a community concern, and that the comfortable fiction of sleepwalking was about to be challenged by people who understood the true nature of what we were facing. Hun Somjai was a man who commanded respect through wisdom rather than authority, someone whose opinions carried weight because they were based on decades of careful observation and deep understanding of the spiritual traditions that governed our community. When he spoke, people listened, and when he expressed concern, that concern was taken seriously by everyone who knew him. He entered our home with the formal courtesy that marked important visits, accepting Mother's offer of tea and taking his time to observe our family's current state before beginning the conversation that had brought him to our door. His eyes lingered on Yam, who sat quietly in the corner, humming that haunting melody under her breath. I have been hearing stories, he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wanted to gather information before making judgments. Stories about midnight wandering, about strange behavior, about changes that have come over your youngest daughter since her visit to the forest shrine. Father shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping that the elder's visit was simply a matter of community concern rather than something more serious. Children sometimes have vivid dreams, he said. The doctor in town says that sleepwalking is not uncommon, especially during times of stress or excitement. But Kun Chai shook his head slowly, his expression grave. This is not sleepwalking, he said. I have seen this before, many years ago, when I was young like you. The signs are unmistakable to those who know how to read them. He paused, studying Yam's distant expression and the way she seemed to be listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Your daughter has been marked by Yai Choi, the witch who lives in the deep forest, he said. The name fell into our quiet house like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition and fear through our family. Mother's hand flew to her mouth, and I saw Father's face pale as the elder's words confirmed fears that we had all been trying to suppress. But Yai Chue is dead, Mother whispered. She died during the cold season. We heard about it from the people in the outer settlements. Death does not always end a witch's influence, Kun Somchai replied, especially when that witch has spent decades building connections to the spirit realm, learning secrets that allow consciousness to persist beyond the boundaries of physical life. He looked directly at me then, as if he could see the supernatural encounters I had witnessed but not yet shared with my family. Yai Chue was not an ordinary woman even when she was alive. She had the gift of sight, the ability to communicate with spirits and to influence the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. But she also had hungers that could not be satisfied by normal human experience, desires that grew stronger as she aged and her own connection to life grew weaker. Therefore, as Kun Somchai began to tell us the story, I realized that our family had become entangled in something far older and more dangerous than a simple supernatural encounter. Yai Chue came to our region more than 40 years ago. She was already middle-aged then, a woman alone, which was unusual enough to attract attention. But it was her knowledge of herbs and healing, her ability to help with difficult births and to cure illnesses that the regular medicine couldn't touch, that made people willing to overlook their suspicions about her solitary lifestyle. She built her house deep in the forest, far from the main village, in a place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground even at midday. People would make the journey to her home when they had problems that couldn't be solved by conventional means. Sick children who wouldn't respond to normal treatments, women who couldn't conceive, men whose crops failed year after year despite their best efforts. And Yai Chue could help them. She had remedies that worked when nothing else would, rituals that could change luck from bad to good, knowledge of the spirit world that allowed her to negotiate with forces that most people couldn't even perceive. But her help always came with a price. Not money. She rarely asked for payment in currency. Instead, she would request small favors, seemingly innocent things. A lock of hair from a healthy child. A piece of clothing worn during a moment of great happiness. A promise to remember her in prayers, to include her in family celebrations, to maintain a connection that she claimed was necessary for her continued ability to help. People were grateful enough to agree to these requests, thinking them harmless. But over the years, those of us who paid attention began to notice patterns. The families who sought Yai Chue's help often found that their good fortune came at the expense of others. A child would recover from illness, but a neighbor's child would fall sick. A woman would conceive after years of barrenness, but her sister would lose a pregnancy. Crops would flourish in one field while withering in the field next door. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to this history, understanding that the ancient agreements the supernatural woman had mentioned were not metaphorical but literal contracts that had been building for decades. What did she want from people? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Life force, Kun Somchai said simply. The energy that makes the difference between a living person and a corpse. She was feeding on it, slowly and carefully, taking just enough from each family to sustain herself without killing anyone outright. But as she grew older, her hunger grew stronger, and the prices she demanded became higher. By the time people realized what was happening, many families were already bound to her by obligations they couldn't break. She had woven herself into the spiritual fabric of our community so thoroughly that removing her influence would have required destroying the very traditions and beliefs that held us together. The elder's expression grew even more grave as he continued his story. When she died last winter, we thought our troubles were over. But death has only made her more dangerous because now she no longer needs to maintain the pretense of helping people. Now she can take what she wants directly without offering anything in return. He looked at Yam, who had stopped humming and was staring at him with an intensity that seemed far beyond her 14 years. And what she wants most is a young life, a healthy spirit that can serve as a bridge between her realm and ours, someone with the sensitivity to hear her calling, the innocence to trust her promises, and the life force to sustain her for decades to come. Therefore, as the full implications of Kun Somchai's revelation settled over our family, I understood that we were not dealing with a random supernatural encounter, but with the culmination of a plan that had been decades in the making. Word of Kun Somchai's visit and his identification of our family's supernatural problem spread through the village. By evening, our small community had organized itself into the kind of collective response that our ancestors had used for generations to deal with threats that exceeded any individual family's ability to handle alone. The village temple became the center of activity, with people bringing offerings of food, flowers, and incense to strengthen the spiritual protections that surrounded our community. The monks who served our temple, men who had dedicated their lives to understanding the balance between the physical and spiritual realms, began conducting special ceremonies designed to create barriers against malevolent supernatural influences. But it wasn't just the formal religious response that mobilized to help our family. The older women in the village, those keepers of traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations, began preparing special amulets and protective charms specifically designed to shield young people from spiritual predators. They worked through the night, weaving blessed threads into patterns that were said to confuse evil spirits, preparing herbal mixtures that could strengthen a person's spiritual defenses, and creating small carved figures that were believed to serve as decoys for supernatural entities seeking to possess the living. These women had seen supernatural threats before, and they knew that protecting a child from spiritual predation required both faith and practical knowledge. Mother was deeply moved by this outpouring of community support, but I could see the fear in her eyes as she watched our neighbors preparing for what was essentially a spiritual war. Do you really think these protections will work? She asked Kun Somchai as we watched the village women arranging blessed amulets around our house. They will help, he replied, but his tone carried reservations that made my heart sink. Traditional protections have power, especially when they are created and maintained by a community united in purpose. But Yai Chui is not an ordinary spirit. She has had decades to study our defenses, to understand our weaknesses, to prepare countermeasures for exactly this kind of response. The protections will slow her down, make it more difficult for her to reach your daughter directly, but they will not stop her permanently. For that, we would need something more powerful than community traditions. He paused, looking at Yam, who sat quietly in the center of all this activity, seemingly unaware of the spiritual battle being waged around her. We would need to find a way to break the connection she has already established, to sever the spiritual bond that allows her to influence your daughter from beyond the grave. And that kind of intervention requires knowledge and power that our village may not possess. Therefore, as I watched our community mobilize all of its traditional resources to protect my sister, I began to understand that we might be fighting a battle we were not equipped to win. The protective measures our community had prepared were put to their first test that very night. We had surrounded our house with blessed amulets, hung protective charms from every doorway and window, and placed carved guardian figures at the cardinal points around our property. Yam wore multiple protective necklaces and carried a small blessed pouch that the village women had prepared specifically for her protection. For the first few hours after sunset, it seemed as if the community's efforts might be successful. Yam appeared more alert and present than she had been in days, participating in family conversation and showing interest in her evening meal. The constant humming that had become her unwelcome companion grew quieter, and the distant expression that had worried us so much began to clear from her eyes. Mother and father allowed themselves to hope that the worst was over, that the combined spiritual power of our entire community had been sufficient to break whatever hold the supernatural entity had established over our daughter. They spoke quietly of returning to normal routines, of the relief they felt at seeing Yam acting like herself again. But I remained watchful, remembering Kaun Somchai's warnings about Yai Chui's cunning and power. And as the night deepened, I began to notice subtle signs that our protective measures were being tested by forces that understood exactly how to work around traditional defenses. The blessed candles that we had lit around the house began to flicker and dim despite the absence of any wind. The protective charms hanging in our doorways started to sway gently as if touched by invisible hands. And most disturbing of all, I could hear something moving around the perimeter of our property. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric brushing against the ground, circling our house with patient persistence. Yam began to grow restless as these signs intensified, her temporary improvement fading as whatever force sought to reclaim her tested the barriers our community had erected. She would start to hum the haunting melody, then catch herself and stop, only to begin again a few minutes later, as if the song were pulling itself out of her against her conscious will. Sis, she whispered to me as we prepared for sleep, I can feel her out there. She's angry about the protections, but she's not afraid of them. She's just waiting. The fear in Yam's voice told me that our community's best efforts had succeeded only in delaying the inevitable, not in preventing it. Therefore, as I lay awake that night listening to the sounds of something supernatural testing the boundaries of our defenses, I knew that we would need to find a more powerful solution if we wanted to save my sister from a fate that traditional protections could only postpone. The attacks began in the early hours of the morning when the protective candles had burned low and the village had settled into the deep sleep that comes just before dawn. I was awakened by a sound I had never heard before, a low rhythmic chanting in a language that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The chanting was coming from outside our house, but when I looked through the window, I could see nothing in the pre-dawn darkness except the faint glow of our protective amulets, which were now pulsing with an unsteady light that suggested they were under severe strain. The blessed charms hanging in our doorways were swaying violently, as if caught in a windstorm, though the air inside our house remained perfectly still. Yam was no longer sleeping peacefully. She lay on her mat with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, her lips moving in silent synchronization with the supernatural chanting that filled the air around our house. When I spoke her name, she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence, as if she were already more connected to whatever force was calling to her than to the family that loved her. The protective necklaces around her neck had begun to smoke, the blessed metal growing hot enough to burn her skin, but she seemed unaware of the pain. The small carved guardian figures that we had placed around her sleeping area were cracking, developing hairline fractures that spread across their surfaces like spider webs, as if the spiritual energy they were designed to contain was too powerful for their physical forms to withstand. Mother, father, something's wrong with Yam, I called, my voice sharp with panic. But even as my parents rushed to her side, I could see that the supernatural assault was intensifying, that whatever force sought to claim my sister was no longer content to work slowly and subtly. The chanting outside our house grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear other sounds joining it: the crack of breaking wood, the hiss of protective charms failing, the whisper of something large and malevolent moving through the darkness around our home. Our community's carefully constructed defenses were being systematically dismantled by an intelligence that understood exactly how to neutralize traditional protections. As our protective defenses crumbled around us and Yem continued to slip away from the physical world, Father made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "We're taking her to the city," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved beyond fear into desperate action. "To the hospital in Chiang Mai. If traditional methods can't help her, maybe modern medicine is the way." Mother looked at him with surprise and concern. "But the doctors won't understand what's happening to her," she protested. "How can we explain that our daughter is being possessed by the spirit of a dead witch? They'll think we're superstitious villagers who don't understand the difference between illness and imagination." "Then we'll tell them she's sick," Father replied. "We'll say she has a fever, that she's not eating, that she's having hallucinations. Maybe the doctors will have medicines that can strengthen her body enough to resist whatever is trying to take her from us." It was a desperate plan, born of the recognition that our traditional resources had proven inadequate against the supernatural threat we faced. But as I looked at Yam, who was now so pale that she seemed more like a ghost than a living girl, I realized that desperate measures might be our only remaining option. Kun Somchai, who had remained with our family throughout the night's supernatural assault, nodded slowly at Father's decision. "Sometimes the old ways and the new ways must work together," he said. "The doctors may not understand the spiritual nature of her condition, but they might be able to help her body maintain its connection to life while we search for other solutions." Therefore, as dawn broke over our village and the supernatural attacks finally subsided, we began preparing for a journey that would take us far from the traditional protections into a modern world that might offer different kinds of help. The decision to take Yam to the hospital in Chiang Mai represented more than just a change in treatment strategy. It was a fundamental shift from the traditional worldview that had governed our family's life for generations to a modern approach that prioritized scientific explanation over spiritual understanding. For my parents, who had never traveled more than a few hours from our village, the prospect of entering the urban world of hospitals and doctors was almost as frightening as the supernatural threat we were fleeing. But as we prepared for the journey, loading our few possessions into the village's only motorized vehicle, I could see the determination in Father's eyes. He was willing to abandon everything familiar, everything comfortable, everything that had defined his understanding of the world if it meant saving his daughter's life. The village gathered to see us off, offering prayers and blessings for our journey, providing what little money they could spare to help with hospital expenses, and promising to continue their own spiritual efforts on Yam's behalf while we were away. The sight of our entire community united in support of our family was both heartening and heartbreaking, a reminder of the bonds that held us together and the traditions we were leaving behind. Yam herself seemed barely aware of the preparations happening around her. She sat quietly in the truck, her eyes distant and unfocused, occasionally humming fragments of that haunting melody that had become her constant companion. As we drove away from our village, following the dirt road that would eventually connect to the paved highway leading to Chiang Mai, I watched the familiar landscape of my childhood disappearing behind us. The rice fields where Father worked, the forest path that Yam and I had walked to school, the ancient shrine where this nightmare had begun, all of it growing smaller and more distant with each mile we traveled. But I also noticed that leaving our village didn't seem to weaken whatever supernatural influence had claimed Yam's attention. If anything, The distance from our community's protective efforts seemed to make her condition worse. "She's still with us," Yam whispered to me as we bounced along the rough road, her voice so soft I had to lean close to hear her words. "Yai Chue, she's following us. She says that running away won't help, that I belong to her now no matter where we go." The fear in my sister's voice combined with the growing certainty that our desperate flight might be futile filled me with a despair so profound that I had to fight back tears. Therefore, as our truck carried us toward the modern world of hospitals, I found myself praying to every spirit, every ancestor, every protective force I had ever heard of, begging them to help us find a solution that neither traditional wisdom nor modern knowledge seemed capable of providing on their own.